In his political fight with Democrats over the government shutdown, Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson is embracing the tactics of GOP hardliners. The Freedom Caucus has spent much of the last decade at odds with party leadership, but the Hill's Emily Brooks writes the once sidelined group's ideas now represent a core of Republican legislative strategy. Emily is the author of The Movement, a weekly newsletter looking at the influences and debates on the right here in Washington. Emily joins us now. So, Emily, tell us about this meeting between Speaker Johnson and the Freedom Caucus last week and what that says about the dynamics right now inside the Republican Party.
Well, the Freedom Caucus is 10 years old now, and it came onto the scene as a group that was pressuring Republican leadership to be more aggressive and adopt more conservative policy aims and goals. And it was unthinkable for much of those 10 years to think that there would be a joint press conference with the House Freedom Caucus, inviting the speaker onto their call and then praising him the whole time for what he was doing in one of the biggest legislative fights of the year. But that is exactly what happened last week on this press call. But I think it was the first ever time that the Freedom Caucus has invited a sitting speaker to talk and in a press conference like that. So they really like what the speaker is doing with his tactic of keeping the House out after the House has passed the Republican crafted clean continuing resolution to keep the government open until November 21st, but not bringing members back amid the shutdown, an attempt to try and pressure Senate Democrats into folding and adopting that plan, even though they have repeatedly now voted that down. But that's exactly the kind of thing that the Freedom Caucus had been advocating for in other legislative fights. Pass something that you really want and then just leave town and let the Senate deal with it. Speaker Johnson is now embracing that strategy.
So we're now in day 14 of this shutdown. What impact do you see the Freedom Caucus having moving forward, and could that impact the potential for a solution to be found?
Yeah, I think that this tactic, while the Freedom Caucus likes it, I think a lot of Republicans and Republican leaders have been a little bit surprised on how dug in that Senate Democrats are. I mean, if you recall the first government funding fight in March, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer did go against the majority of Democrats and voted to fund the government and gave the okay for other members to join him in allowing that to go through. It's much different this time. The stakes are higher for Chuck Schumer, and Democrats are a lot more united in trying to use this government funding leverage point to extract concessions, particularly on healthcare policy and those expiring tax credits, those Obamacare tax credits expiring at the end of the year. So with all of that going on, the two sides sort of at a stalemate. There have been Republicans in the House outside of the Freedom Caucus who are saying, why are we not in session? Why do we look like we're avoiding this fight? We should be back in session working on other things, maybe even negotiating on a path forward to reopen the government. But so there is, some risk here for the speaker that this does not go the way that the Freedom Caucus hardline tactics would prefer it to go and result in Democrats folding. However, this is just day 14. There's a way to go. The longest government shutdown was 35 days. There's quite a possibility this lasts beyond that. And so I think whether or not they continue this strategy, if it does work, it will be a major validation of that kind of Freedom Caucus ethos of maximum leverage points and pressure in these legislative battles.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a risk here for Johnson aligning himself so closely with the Freedom Caucus, not just to push him maybe to the right of the Republican conference, but also to the right of where the average American voter stands on issues like healthcare and these ACA subsidies.
That is certainly a risk, although I think that you have to remember that Speaker Johnson himself, one of the reasons why he won the speakership after McCarthy was ousted is because he is sincerely a very politically, legislatively conservative person himself. He formerly led the Republican Study Committee, which is a caucus like the House Freedom Caucus, but this is the largest caucus. It's more, instead of being so tactics focused, it's more about crafting conservative policy, sort of like a think tank inside of the House GOP. And that's kind of where the Speaker Johnson comes from. He previously chaired that, and now he is a Speaker of the House. And so I think maybe on average, he's going to be a little bit more on the conservative side, but he has even admitted that doesn't always result in him being able to push conservative policies because of the realities of where some of his more moderate members lie.
How does President Trump play into all this? Obviously, members of the Freedom Caucus have aligned themselves with President Trump, but he's not exactly a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. Is there a critique of the Freedom Caucus that could be made that they're bending to President Trump's will and not always standing up for the conservative principles that they were founded on?
Certainly. And I think that we have seen that criticism earlier this year with the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill. There were some points where the Republicans in the Freedom Caucus were holding up action on that as they were trying to get more conservative policy solutions, but ended up voting for it without getting any actual legislative text changes because they say they got commitments from the Trump administration to do that. So, in a Republican in this environment, nobody wants to be seen as being on the opposite side of Donald Trump in most instances. So that is certainly a dynamic that I think can make them more cooperative with leadership and the rest of Republicans in some senses. But then you also have the flip side to where you have one of their top allies who has been at Freedom Caucus meetings when Trump was no longer president, Russ Vought, director of the Office of Management and Budget. He is not a former member of Congress, but he is really essentially a Freedom Caucus guy. And so there are people in the Trump administration that the Freedom Caucus knows, is aligned with, and trusts. And so they are more likely to go along with what the Trump administration wants.
President Trump is back from this overseas trip now. I wonder if you have any insight onto what the thinking is in conservative circles about how the president is going to weigh in to this shutdown situation. He's talked about possibly negotiating over these ACA subsidies. Is there concern that President Trump might kind of give in to Democrats and give them what they want in order to reopen the government and kind of buck what the Freedom Caucus wants?
Yeah, there have been a lot of instances where the White House and the messaging from the administration was not quite in sync with what congressional leaders were saying. And that, what you mentioned, Trump expressing openness and maybe negotiating on some of these healthcare subsidies. This was, something that, Trump is a deal maker. He wrote The Art of the Deal. He likes being seen as cutting deals, but this is not something that there's a lot of consensus on within the House Republican Conference or even among Senate Republicans. It's going to be a long road to try and negotiate any kind of extension. And it's not something that congressional leaders want to do in a shutdown. They don't think that there's enough time. And so when Trump said that and then, walked that back later on social media, that, showed a bit of a split. But everything that the congressional leaders are doing now, they're kind of managing it while Trump is not fully tuned in to what is going on. He has been in the Middle East. He's helping negotiate and secure peace deals. He's not really thinking about maybe as much the legislative tactics or strategy other than trusting congressional leaders to go and put pressure on Democrats. But if that changes, if he says, let's negotiate the deal, I want the Democratic leaders to come in. I do support extending some of these healthcare subsidies in some form. That will dramatically, I think, change the calculus. And that is also something that I'm sure the Freedom Caucus is aware of and why it's important for them to have their allies like Russ Vought in the administration as well.
Always interesting hearing about the inner workings of the modern Republican Party. That's why we love to read your newsletter. And people should go over to thehill.com, click on newsletters, and have the movement delivered right to their inbox. Emily Brooks, thanks so much.
Thank you.